Okay, good morning. My name's Philip Crowe. I'm a PhD candidate funded by the Tourist Project for the past 4 years, coming to the end of it. I've got about 3 weeks to go, so today's task is not to explain to you my PhD thesis. It's to introduce, it's a much more pleasant task, it's to introduce to you some of the projects that have come out of the journey of the Dublin partners. So the Dublin partners being Dublin City Council as the local authority partner, UCD as an academic partner, and Dermot Foley Landscape Architects as the SME partner. So it's been a very much a transdisciplinary process. And as Zaritza mentioned a few minutes ago, all of these experiments that I'm going to present today, and I'm only presenting 3 of them, they're all the result of collaborations and networks with local communities. And they've all been developed in collaboration, and they're all being operated in collaboration with citizens and community groups. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank all those people for their generous and very significant contribution to this work. And I know that several people from those community groups and citizens are in the room today. So our brief as the Dublin partners was, I suppose, quite open-ended. It was basically to try and figure out what does this nebulous concept of urban resilience, it's a shiny new idea, mean in practice. And I suppose we've come up, what has emerged from it are slightly surprisingly fundamental and simple ideas that we feel can help cities adapt to change. So to give you some examples, the 3 I'm going to talk about today, the first one, reusing Dublin, it's simply trying to understand how spaces are used in the city or how spaces are not used in the city. The second one, collaborations, is looking at making community groups and collaborative projects visible and accessible, which sounds fairly simple. But like all of these things, they sound simple, but actually when you get into them, they're extremely complex and do involve an awful lot of work. And the third one, called Compass, is simply trying to provide a guide for activating community projects. So I'm going to introduce each in turn. I'm going to set out what the challenges were, what are these innovations or these projects, these experiments, what are they responding to? I'm going to describe each experiment very briefly. I'm being timed. So I've got 15 minutes. And then I'm going to reflect on what has been learned and where they might be going in the future. And I suppose it's important to say that actually after tourists, most of these innovations are homeless and they need to have a life beyond tourists, and they need to have some form of an organization take them on and support them into the future. Or possibly they become part of a future Horizon 2020 project. So, get underway. I'm going to start with reusing Dublin. And reusing Dublin basically responds to the fact that there are an awful lot of vacant and underused spaces in this city. And I'm sure everybody in the room, whether you're a resident in the city or you're a visitor, you are all aware of that. There are a number of negative consequences to this, obviously, and they can relate to urban sprawl, to natural resource depletion, to detrimental visual and social impacts, to reductions in the viability of businesses and services, things like public transport, and also to a false impression of scarcity in the city, which drives up property prices. And this is one of the things that's recognized to have driven the property bubble that we all suffered from a number of years ago. And as citizens, we can be very frustrated by this proliferation of underused spaces and feel very disempowered in relation to addressing the issue and feel that there aren't alternatives, and how do we do something, particularly whenever there's such a severe housing crisis at the moment. And what we find out is that the extent of and distribution of these underused spaces in the city is not known. It's not known in any part of Ireland. So that makes it very difficult to grasp the extent of the problem, the nature of the problem, and to recognize the consequences. It also makes it very difficult to raise awareness and to advocate for change. And part of the reason for this extent not being known is possibly that it's actually really difficult to map underuse. It's very resource intensive due to the scale and fluidity of the data. It changes very quickly. And Dublin City Council has found this out in a number of vacant land surveys from 2013 and 2015. And I know there's a revision underway at the moment. And there is now an urgent need in Ireland, certainly. The situation is different in each country, as we found out through the Tourist Project. But there is an urgent need in Ireland to figure out how to map these spaces, because we have new legislation which comes into force next year, so from January, every local authority has to start mapping vacant spaces that meet certain criteria under the Urban Regeneration and Housing Act 2015. And it's really not clear how this is going to be achieved. So it's a perfect puzzle for a transdisciplinary research project like Tourists, and we've had a go at it. And we set out basically to explore the potential of volunteer geographical information, which is more or less the same thing as crowdsourcing, to reveal this distributed and tacit and unspoken knowledge that exists within the community. So we've gone about this by putting up, since April 2015, an online civic engagement platform called Reusing Dublin. And if you have your smartphones with you, please look it up, look up our social media channels, join up, add to our statistics. And what this is trying to do is map underused spaces in the city. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's a very broad category, and we're actually interested in what citizens come back with as what they regard as underused spaces. But they might be vacant sites that are very obviously vacant in plain view. They might be boarded up houses. It might be partially used state-owned office buildings. There's plenty of them around the city. Abandoned gardens and back lanes, or spaces left over after infrastructure planning, and the list goes on. Each space gets its own profile window, and you can discover and share information and find out things like ownership details, the planning history, etc. And anybody can add information or correct information, and anybody can add a marker. So people have been adding spaces over the past, what are we now, 18 months. We've identified spaces as well, so there's a number of student projects that have inputted into this, and then also existing databases from people like Antashka and from Dublin City Council that have gone onto it. And as I say, we've got our social media channels where we try and encourage people to give us information on various sites, and that can actually be very productive because people do know this information, or there might have been a newspaper article on a site a number of years ago or a number of months ago. And of course, not everybody's online, so we've done a number of offline events such as walking tours and cycling tours, etc. But it's a very basic tool. It's a modest project at this stage. So what have we learned from it? In terms of the mapping, it's been reasonably successful. People have contributed. We have about 670 sites up on the map at the moment. About 12% of them we think are crowdsourced, which is actually quite a lot. And it starts to reveal that actually the sites that qualify for the vacant sites levy, which is coming into force next year, they represent about a third of the sites that the public perceives as vacant, which could be quite useful in terms of thinking about that piece of legislation. But the map certainly doesn't give a definitive picture of underuse in the city. That's possibly an impossible task. But it does start to indicate the extent of underuse. And the huge potential, actually, of the existing urban fabric to accommodate more uses. And it's quite an interesting process when you start trying to map underuse in the city. You start to almost flip the question and ask, well, what part of the city is used efficiently? I mean, it can be quite alarming, and I could take you all on a walk within 5 minutes of this space, and we'd be looking at parts of the city that are barely used at all. Where the project has definitely been much more successful is in civic engagement, and it has engaged an enormous number of people with this issue. I've got all sorts of statistics, tens of thousands of people visiting the website, etc. And one of the interesting things is that those visits are only less than half of them are from Ireland, and there's a significant number from overseas, therefore, and particularly from Russia, which I'm intrigued by, particularly large industrial cities around the west of Russia. So what it has managed to do is to engage citizens successfully with their place and with local issues through this process of mapping. Now, in the future, we're looking for ways to develop a much more sophisticated tool, which we're pretentiously calling Reusing Dublin 2. But as of this month, and actually as of today, possibly, I'm not sure which day this week it's going to happen, but the Peter McVerry Trust has identified that this is a useful tool for them to map vacant houses throughout the state. And they are partnering with us for the next 4 or 6 months. We're not sure how long. And they're going to use that to gain information on the 200,000 vacant houses there are in the state. Which, it sounds like we know the number of them, but we don't actually know where they are exactly. And we don't know information like ownership and why they're vacant, etc. So they've taken the initiative and asked to partner with us, so we've been able to give the project a life going forward. We've also been asked by the Heritage Council to develop versions of this for country towns on a smaller scale, and it may work extremely well for smaller scale towns because the Irish country towns are suffering a lot in terms of decline. So that's Reusing Dublin. Please check it out online and add some sites if you know any of them.